Right, let me tell you about computer chips, hard work, and taking over the world by complete accident. Because apparently, some people get to live the dream, whilst the rest of us are stuck complaining about the weather and watching our heating bills skyrocket. These are the things that turned a 9-year-old kid from Taiwan, who couldn't speak a word of English, into the most powerful boss on Earth, running a $4 trillion company that controls the future of smart computers. Jensen Huang, always wearing his black leather jacket like some sort of tech bloke's uniform, now decides whether every big tech company lives or dies as they fight desperately for his special computer parts that are worth more than gold. This quiet immigrant lad, who got walloped with a wooden paddle at a tough Kentucky school, has built the most important technology company in history, proving that the American dream isn't just real, it's running our entire digital world, whilst those of us in Britain can barely get our broadband to work properly. Jensen's hidden journey from a dishwasher's son to the king of artificial intelligence isn't just changing how the world thinks about computer power, but showing how immigrant determination mixed with Silicon Valley opportunity can accidentally create the backbone for humanity's biggest leap forward. The bloke who started Nvidia at a Denny's restaurant table has become the puppet master, controlling every AI breakthrough, every self-driving car, and every digital change happening around the globe. Whilst staying so humble, he still cooks breakfast for his workers and remembers their kids' names. This is the story of how a scared foreign kid who survived reform school, near bankruptcy, and countless failures accidentally built the machine that powers artificial intelligence, making him not just incredibly rich, but the person who gets to decide what our robot-filled future looks like. Now, before we dive into this absolutely mental tale of success, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button, won't you? You'll want to stick around for more stories like this one. Right then, let me tell you about Jensen Huang's beginnings, which were considerably more dramatic than most childhoods, and twice as mental as anything you'd see on the telly. Certainly more exciting than my own dreary existence watching paint dry in this godforsaken weather. Our story starts in 1963 in Taiwan, a small island off the coast of China, where Jensen was born into a world of fear and uncertainty that would make even today's political shambles look like a proper tea party. Taiwan was under military rule back then, and Jensen's father worked as a chemical engineer whilst his mother taught piano lessons. Life was hard, the future looked absolutely grim, and political tensions made everything feel like it might go pear-shaped at any moment. But Jensen was just a regular kid who loved to take apart radios and build things with his hands, showing more mechanical sense at age 5 than most grown-ups manage in their entire lives. He was curious about everything, always asking, how does this work? And what if we tried this instead? The sort of questions that would drive any sensible adult completely balmy. But Taiwan in the 1960s wasn't a place where a kid could dream big dreams or get above himself. The country was skint, cut off from the world, and constantly worried about proper war with mainland China. When Jensen turned 9 years old, his parents made the hardest decision any parent could possibly make. They decided to send their 2 young sons to America alone, whilst they stayed behind in Taiwan. His parents had heard that America was the land of opportunity, where kids could get a decent education and build brilliant lives. But they couldn't afford to move the whole family, so they made an absolutely extraordinary sacrifice. Think about being 9 years old and getting on a plane to a country where you don't speak the language, don't know a soul, and haven't got a clue what's waiting for you. Jensen and his older brother were scared stiff, but they trusted their parents' belief that America would give them chances Taiwan simply couldn't offer. The plane ride to America must have felt like traveling to another planet entirely. Jensen couldn't read the English signs, couldn't understand what people were saying, and couldn't even ask for help when he was in a proper pickle. Everything was bigger, louder, and more confusing than anything he'd ever seen in his life. But here's where the story takes a shocking turn that would make even the poshest British boarding schools look like holiday camps. Jensen's uncle, who was supposed to look after them in America, had enrolled the boys in what he thought was a brilliant boarding school in Kentucky. What the poor bloke didn't realize was that Oneida Baptist Institute wasn't a regular school at all. It was a reform school for troubled American kids. Suddenly, Jensen found himself in rural Kentucky, surrounded by kids who had been sent there for fighting, nicking things, and causing all sorts of bother. He was a small Asian lad who couldn't speak proper English, dropped into a place specifically designed to sort out American troublemakers. It was like throwing a lamb into a den of wolves, absolutely mental. The school used old-fashioned punishment methods that would shock most people today. When kids broke rules, they got walloped with wooden paddles. The food was absolutely dreadful. The rooms were freezing cold, and the other kids picked on anyone who seemed different or weak. Jensen was about as different as a kid could possibly be. For most 9-year-olds, this would have been the end of the story. They would have given up completely, cried every day, and begged to go home to their families. But something rather extraordinary happened to Jensen in that harsh place. Instead of breaking his spirit, the tough school made him incredibly strong and determined. He learned to fight back when kids picked on him. He learned to work twice as hard as everyone else just to keep up with the lessons. Most importantly, he learned that no matter how rubbish things got, he could survive absolutely anything if he just refused to give up and quit. Jensen spent 2 whole years at that reform school, learning English by watching the other kids and practicing every single day until his tongue hurt. He studied harder than everyone else because he had to. Whilst other kids moaned about homework, Jensen saw it as his ticket to a better life in America. Those 2 years of survival training, disguised as education, taught Jensen lessons that would serve him well for the rest of his life. He learned that being different wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something that could make you stronger. He learned that hard work could overcome almost any disadvantage. And he learned that Americans respected people who fought for what they wanted, even if they started with absolutely nothing. After 2 years of what can only be described as character-building hell, Jensen finally got to reunite with his parents, who had managed to move to Oregon. But Jensen wasn't the same scared little boy who had left Taiwan. He was tougher, more determined, and absolutely hungry to prove himself in this new country. In Oregon, Jensen discovered something that would change his life forever: computers. This was the 1970s, when computers were massive great machines that filled entire rooms and only posh universities and big companies could afford. Unlike today, where we can't even get our government's computers to process a bloody passport application properly. But Jensen was absolutely fascinated by these mechanical beasts that could solve problems and create things that had never existed before. He threw himself into studying maths and science with the same intensity he'd used to survive reform school. Whilst other kids played sports or watched the telly, Jensen spent hours trying to understand how electricity could be turned into information, how circuits could think, and how these brilliant machines actually worked. His parents were proud, but worried. They wanted Jensen to become a doctor or lawyer. Safe, respectable jobs that would guarantee a good life. But Jensen had found his calling. He wanted to build the future, not just live in it. At Oregon State University, and later at Stanford, proper posh universities that actually mattered, unlike the second-rate institutions we're stuck with here, where they spend more time on strikes than teaching. Jensen studied electrical engineering, which is basically the science of making computer chips. This was like learning to speak the language of the future, whilst most people were still trying to figure out how to program their video recorders. But Jensen wasn't just studying in lecture halls. He was working jobs to pay for school, learning about business, and watching how Silicon Valley was starting to change the world. Companies like Intel and Apple were showing that small groups of clever people could build technologies that transformed absolutely everything. During his university years, Jensen had a vision that would later change the world. He realized that computers were going to become much more than just calculating machines. They were going to create pictures, videos, and experiences that looked real. But the computers of the 1980s were absolutely rubbish at graphics. They could barely draw simple shapes without taking ages. Jensen saw the future. Computers that could create movie-quality graphics, games that looked real, and digital worlds that people could explore. But the technology didn't exist yet. Someone would have to invent it from scratch. After graduating from Stanford with a master's degree in electrical engineering, Jensen went to work for companies that made computer chips. But working for someone else felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit properly. He had bigger ideas, bigger dreams, and a growing feeling that he was meant to build something revolutionary. The call to adventure came in the form of a simple question. What if graphics could be for everyone, not just expensive professional computers? What if regular people could have computers that created beautiful pictures and brilliant games? Most people thought this was completely bonkers. Graphics were too expensive, too complicated, and too slow for regular computers. But Jensen had learned something important from his time at reform school. Impossible just means nobody has figured out how to do it yet. By 1993, Jensen had a decent job at LSY Logic, a successful computer chip company. He was married to his college sweetheart, Lori. They had started a family, and life was comfortable. He was making good money, had job security, and could have easily settled into a nice, predictable career. His parents were finally proud. Their son, who had survived reform school and learned English, was now a successful engineer in Silicon Valley. The American dream had worked exactly like they hoped. Why rock the boat and risk everything? Jensen could have stayed safe. He could have worked his way up the corporate ladder, retired with a decent pension, and lived a perfectly fine life. Many immigrants who had overcome what he'd overcome would have been grateful for this stability and not pushed their luck. But comfort felt like a prison to someone who had survived reform school and learned to fight for everything. Jensen kept seeing opportunities that nobody else noticed. The computer graphics market was growing fast, but all the existing companies were making the same mistakes. They were building expensive, complicated products for a tiny market of professionals. Jensen had a different vision. He could see that regular people would want better graphics, too. Video games were becoming popular. Personal computers were getting cheaper. The internet was starting to connect everyone. Soon, millions of people would want computers that could create beautiful pictures and realistic games. But pursuing this vision meant giving up everything safe. It meant leaving his job, risking his family's security, and probably failing like most startup companies do. Lori was pregnant with their second child. They had a mortgage, bills, and responsibilities that couldn't just be ignored. For months, Jensen wrestled with the choice: stay safe and comfortable, or risk everything to chase a vision that might be completely wrong. His immigrant parents had already sacrificed so much to give him opportunities. How could he throw away their gift for some mad dream about graphics cards? The refusal of the call wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and practical. Jensen kept his job, kept collecting paychecks, and kept telling himself that maybe entrepreneurship wasn't for him. Maybe the smart thing was to play it safe and not get too big for his boots. But refusing your true calling is like trying to stop a river with your bare hands. The vision kept growing stronger. Jensen would lie awake at night, thinking about the graphics revolution that nobody else could see coming. He started sketching ideas for computer chips that could make graphics fast and cheap. He began calculating how much money the graphics market could be worth if someone built the right products. Finally, the pressure became unbearable. Jensen realized that he would regret playing it safe for the rest of his life. The reform school kid who had learned to fight for everything couldn't accept a life of comfortable surrender. In early 1993, Jensen was ready to answer the call to adventure, but he couldn't do it alone. Creating a computer chip company required expertise in areas he didn't understand, connections he didn't have, and skills he hadn't developed. He needed proper partners, not just cheerleaders. That's when he met his co-founders, Chris Malachowski and Curtis Preem. These weren't wise old teachers with long beards. They were fellow engineers who shared Jensen's vision and had the skills to make it real. Chris Malachowski was a graphics expert who understood the technical challenges of making computer chips draw pictures fast. He had worked at Sun Microsystems and knew how to turn mental ideas into actual products that worked properly. Curtis Preem was a chip designer who could figure out how to build the complex circuits that would make their vision real. He understood the nuts and bolts of making silicon wafers, think and calculate at incredible speeds. Together, the three men formed a brilliant team. Jensen was the visionary who could see the future market. Chris was the graphics genius who knew what was technically possible. Curtis was the chip wizard who could build anything they designed. But their most important meeting happened at a Denny's restaurant in San Jose, California. This wasn't a fancy boardroom or high-tech conference room. It was a 24-hour greasy spoon where truckers, students, and shift workers grabbed cheap meals, sitting in a red vinyl booth. sharing coffee and pie, probably better coffee than the dishwater they serve at my local greasy spoon, the three engineers outlined their plan to revolutionize computer graphics. They drew diagrams on napkins, calculated market sizes on the backs of menus, and made promises to each other that would either make them rich or destroy their careers completely. The partnership wasn't just about technical knowledge. Jensen learned crucial lessons about leadership, business strategy, and how to build a company culture that could survive the inevitable storms ahead. Chris and Curtis also helped Jensen understand something vital. The computer industry was changing so fast that small companies could beat giant corporations if they moved quickly and took smart risks. Companies like Intel and Microsoft had started in garages and grown into empires. There was no reason three clever engineers couldn't do the same thing. The sort of entrepreneurial spirit that's been completely crushed here in Britain, where we're too busy regulating everything to death and drowning in red tape. Their partnership was based on mutual respect and complementary strengths. Jensen wasn't the smartest engineer or the most experienced businessman, but he had the vision and determination to drive the team forward when things got tough. The decision to quit their jobs and start Nvidia wasn't made in a moment of inspiration. It was the result of months of planning, calculating, and building trust. By the time they walked out of that Denny's restaurant, they weren't just three individual engineers anymore. They were a team with a shared mission to change the world. Quitting stable jobs to start a company in Jensen's garage was like jumping off a cliff and hoping to build wings on the way down. None of them had ever run a company before. They didn't have business degrees, marketing experience, or connections to investors. What they had was $40,000 of their own money, unlimited determination, and a belief that they could build something that had never existed before. Their first office was rented space above a hair salon, where the smell of chemicals and the sound of blow dryers provided a constant reminder that they were far from the big leagues. The name Nvidia came from combining NV, which stood for next version, with a sound that suggested invidia, the Latin word for envy. They wanted other companies to envy their technology, which was either brilliant marketing or completely balmy confidence. But crossing the threshold from employees to entrepreneurs was harder than any of them expected. Suddenly, they weren't just responsible for their own work, they were responsible for everything. Marketing, sales, accounting, customer service, manufacturing, and 100 other tasks they had never done before. Jensen discovered that being a CEO meant making decisions with incomplete information, motivating people when things looked hopeless, and taking responsibility for every failure. The reform school toughness that had seemed like ancient history became his most valuable asset. The computer graphics market in 1993 was dominated by expensive, specialized companies that sold graphics cards to professional engineers and designers. These cards cost thousands of pounds and were so complicated that only experts could use them properly. Jensen's team had a radically different vision. Graphics cards that regular people could afford, that worked with normal computers, and that made games and multimedia applications look absolutely brilliant. But building this required solving technical problems that nobody had solved before. Their first product, the NV1, was supposed to revolutionize 3D graphics for consumers. They spent months designing chips, writing software, and preparing for a market that they were sure would embrace their innovation with open arms. But crossing the threshold also meant facing the first major test of their journey. The NV1 was a complete disaster. They had bet on the wrong graphics standard, made design choices that didn't work with popular games, and created a product that almost nobody wanted to buy. The failure was devastating. They had spent most of their money, disappointed their first customers, and proved that maybe the big companies were right. Maybe consumer graphics was an impossible market after all. But crossing the threshold isn't just about success, it's about commitment. When the NV1 failed, Jensen and his team had a choice: give up and go back to safe jobs, or learn from their mistakes and try again. The reform school kid who had learned to get knocked down and get back up chose to fight. The three founders decided that failure was just information, not a verdict. They would use what they learned from the NV1 disaster to build something better. The years from 1995 to 1999 were Jensen's trial by fire. This was when Nvidia faced every challenge that destroys most startup companies, running out of money, losing key employees, making terrible decisions, and fighting bigger, stronger competitors with deeper pockets. The first major test came when they almost ran completely out of cash. After the NV1 failure, Nvidia had burned through most of their startup money and couldn't find new investors willing to take a punt on them. They had exactly 30 days of operating expenses left in the bank. Jensen had to make the hardest decision of his entrepreneurial life: fire half their employees to save money. These weren't just workers, they were friends, colleagues, and true believers who had taken risks to join a startup. Jensen had to look people in the eye and tell them their dreams were over. The guilt was absolutely crushing. Jensen barely slept, constantly worried about the families he was affecting, and wondered if he had led good peoples into a complete disaster. But the reform school experience had taught him that survival sometimes requires making terrible choices. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Sega, the video game company. Sega needed graphics chips for their new game console and was willing to give Nvidia a contract that would keep them alive. But at the last minute, Sega changed their mind and cancelled the deal completely. Most companies would have died right there. But Jensen had learned something important from his reform school days. When you're desperate, you become incredibly creative. With 30 days of money left, Nvidia pivoted to a completely different strategy. Instead of trying to build revolutionary technology, they focused on building something that actually worked and that customers actually wanted. The Riva 128 chip wasn't the most advanced graphics processor ever created, but it was fast, cheap, and compatible with popular games. The Riva 128 saved Nvidia's life. Computer manufacturers started buying their chips. Gamers discovered that Nvidia cards made their games look brilliant, and suddenly, the company that had been almost bankrupt was growing rapidly. But success brought new enemies. Intel, the giant chip company, saw Nvidia's growth and decided to crush them by building competing graphics chips. 3DFX, another graphics company, had more money and better technology in some areas. Jensen learned that in the technology industry, paranoia isn't mental illness, it's survival strategy. Every day, Nvidia had to innovate faster, work harder, and take smarter risks than companies with 10 times their resources. The key ally that emerged during this period was the gaming community. Gamers weren't just customers. They were passionate evangelists who tested Nvidia's products, provided feedback, and spread word-of-mouth recommendations that no marketing budget could buy. Unlike most British consumers who just moan about everything and never appreciate genuine innovation, American gamers actually got excited about new technology. Jensen made a crucial decision that would define Nvidia's culture. They would always listen to their customers and iterate quickly based on real-world feedback. This wasn't just good business, it was survival strategy for a small company fighting giants. Another important ally was Sony, who chose Nvidia to provide graphics chips for the original PlayStation console. This partnership gave Nvidia steady revenue, credibility with other potential customers, and experience building chips for consumer electronics. But the most important test during these years wasn't technical or financial, it was psychological. Jensen had to learn how to lead a company through constant crisis, make decisions with incomplete information, and maintain optimism when everything seemed absolutely hopeless. By 2006, Nvidia had survived their startup phase and become a successful graphics card company. They were making money, growing steadily, and had established themselves as a major player in the computer graphics market. Jensen could have been satisfied with building a solid, profitable business, but success created a new kind of crisis. Jensen could see that the computer industry was about to change in ways that could make Nvidia completely irrelevant. Graphics cards were becoming a mature market with lots of competition and shrinking profit margins. Jensen had a vision that seemed completely bonkers to everyone else. Graphics processors could be used for much more than just graphics. The same parallel processing power that made games look beautiful could also solve complex mathematical problems, simulate scientific experiments, and maybe even power artificial intelligence. This vision led to Nvidia's biggest gamble, spending hundreds of millions of pounds to develop CUDA, a programming platform that would let software developers use graphics cards for general computing tasks. Wall Street analysts thought Jensen had completely lost his marbles. The ordeal wasn't just financial, it was existential. For the next 15 years, Nvidia would spend billions of pounds on CUDA development, whilst most people couldn't understand why a graphics company was trying to become a computing platform. Investors complained that Jensen was wasting money on projects that had nothing to do with Nvidia's core business. Competitors mocked CUDA as an expensive distraction. Even some Nvidia employees wondered if their CEO had become obsessed with an impossible dream. The darkest moments came when CUDA seemed like a complete failure. Years passed without significant adoption. The software was complicated, the benefits weren't obvious to most developers, and Nvidia was bleeding money on a project that seemed to have no market. Jensen faced the ultimate test of leadership, continuing to invest in a vision that almost nobody else believed in, whilst running a public company that had to show profits every quarter. The pressure was enormous. There were moments when Jensen questioned everything. Maybe the analysts were right. Maybe graphics cards should just do graphics. Maybe he was risking the entire company on a fantasy that would never become real. But the reform school kid who had learned to survive anything refused to give up. Jensen had seen the future. Computers would need massive parallel processing power for artificial intelligence, scientific simulation, and applications that hadn't been invented yet. Graphics processors were perfectly designed for these tasks. They just needed the right software tools. The ordeal tested everything Jensen had learned about leadership, vision, and persistence. This wasn't about surviving a business crisis or beating competitors. This was about betting the entire company on a future that existed only in his imagination. During these dark years, Jensen kept Nvidia's graphics business running, whilst secretly building the infrastructure for a computing revolution that most people couldn't see coming. It was like building a bridge to an island that didn't exist yet, hoping that someday the island would appear. The first hint that Jensen's mental bet might actually work came from an unexpected source: cryptocurrency miners. In 2017, people trying to mine Bitcoin and other digital currencies discovered that Nvidia's graphics cards were absolutely brilliant at the mathematical calculations required for cryptocurrency mining. Suddenly, gamers couldn't buy graphics cards because miners were buying every chip Nvidia could produce. The company's revenue exploded, but Jensen realized this was just a preview of something much bigger. At the same time, artificial intelligence researchers at universities and tech companies had quietly been using Nvidia's graphics cards to train machine learning models. The parallel processing power that made games look beautiful also made AI algorithms learn faster. But the real vindication came on November 30th, 2022, when OpenAI released ChatGPT to the public. Overnight, the entire world discovered artificial intelligence, and every AI application depended on the specialized chips that only Nvidia knew how to make properly. The transformation was absolutely stunning. Nvidia's stock price went from $143 to over $1,000 in just 2 years. The company's market value grew from $350 billion to over $4 trillion, making it more valuable than entire countries' economies. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Jensen had accidentally built the infrastructure for humanity's next technological revolution. Every major AI breakthrough, from self-driving cars to medical diagnosis to scientific research, depended on Nvidia's chips and software. Tech giants like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Meta suddenly found themselves dependent on Nvidia for their most important projects. These companies, which had once seemed unstoppable, were now begging Jensen for access to his chips. The reward wasn't just financial success, it was vindication of a vision that had seemed impossible. The graphics company that Wall Street analysts had criticized for wasting money on CUDA had become the most essential technology company in the world. Jensen's 15-year bet on parallel computing had created a monopoly in the most important technology market of the 21st century. Nvidia controlled over 90% of the AI chip market, and their closest competitors were years behind. The sort of market dominance that British companies can only dream about whilst they struggled to compete with anyone. But perhaps the greatest reward was personal. The immigrant kid who had learned English at a reform school was now one of the most powerful people in technology. World leaders called him for advice. University students studied his strategies. Entrepreneurs around the world tried to copy his methods. Yet Jensen remained remarkably humble. He still wore the same black leather jacket to every public appearance. He still cooked breakfast for Nvidia employees. He still drove himself to work and remembered people's names and their children's birthdays. The reward phase also brought new responsibilities. Jensen realized that Nvidia's technology would shape the future of human civilization. Artificial intelligence could solve climate change, cure diseases, and unlock scientific discoveries. But it could also be used for surveillance, warfare, and control. As Nvidia's chips became essential for national security and economic competitiveness, Jensen found himself at the center of global politics. The US government restricted chip exports to China. Other countries tried to build their own AI chip industries. Nvidia's technology had become a geopolitical weapon. By 2024, Nvidia was so important to the global economy that any problem with their chip supply could crash stock markets, delay AI research, and affect national security. The road back to the ordinary world meant learning to manage success responsibly. Jensen couldn't just focus on building brilliant products anymore. He had to consider how Nvidia's decisions would affect millions of jobs, entire industries, and international relations. One of the biggest challenges was managing demand for Nvidia's chips. Every tech company in the world wanted to buy as many AI processors as possible, but Nvidia couldn't manufacture enough chips to meet demand. This created waiting lists, bidding wars, and intense pressure to expand production quickly. Jensen had to navigate complex relationships with chip manufacturers in Taiwan, Korea, and other countries. Nvidia designed the chips, but other companies actually built them. Any disruption in this global supply chain could shut down AI development worldwide. The company also faced new competition as other firms realized how profitable the AI chip market had become. Intel, AMD, Google, Amazon, and even governments were investing billions of pounds to challenge Nvidia's dominance. But Jensen's biggest challenge was cultural. How do you maintain the startup spirit and innovative culture that made Nvidia successful when you're running a $4 trillion company with over 30,000 employees? Jensen worked hard to keep Nvidia feeling like a family rather than a giant corporation. He still held all-hands meetings where he personally answered employee questions. He maintained the tradition of cooking breakfast for workers during important product launches. The road back also meant dealing with intense scrutiny from governments, investors, and the media. Every decision Jensen made was analyzed by thousands of experts. Every public statement was examined for clues about Nvidia's future strategy. Perhaps most importantly, Jensen had to help society understand and adapt to the AI revolution that Nvidia had enabled. He became an evangelist for artificial intelligence, explaining how AI could solve humanity's biggest problems whilst acknowledging the risks and challenges. Jensen began speaking at universities, government meetings, and international conferences about the responsible development of AI technology. He advocated for education programs that would help workers adapt to an AI-powered economy. The road back wasn't about returning to where he started. It was about using his success to create positive change in the world. Jensen realized that Nvidia's technology gave him both power and responsibility to shape humanity's future. Today, Jensen Huang represents something much bigger than business success. His journey from a scared immigrant kid to the leader of the AI revolution embodies the promise that America offers to anyone willing to work hard and dream big. The lesson that Jensen brings back to the ordinary world isn't just wealth or technology. It's proof that the American dream is alive and more powerful than ever. His story shows that it doesn't matter where you come from or what obstacles you face. With enough determination, you can change the world. But Jensen's version of the American dream is different from the traditional story. He didn't just achieve personal success. He accidentally created technology that will benefit all of humanity. Nvidia's AI chips are helping doctors diagnose diseases faster, scientists understand climate change better, and researchers develop new medicines. The immigrant who learned English by watching telly is now enabling machines to understand and generate human language. The kid who got walloped with wooden paddles for breaking rules is now writing the rules for artificial intelligence development. Jensen's story also shows how American values like innovation, risk-taking, and individual initiative can create global benefits. Nvidia's technology is being used around the world to solve problems that affect everyone. But perhaps the most important lesson Jensen offers is a new model of leadership. In an industry known for arrogant CEOs and cutthroat competition, Jensen has built a company culture based on humility, learning from failure, and treating employees like family. He proves that you can be incredibly successful without losing your humanity. The billionaire who could buy anything still wears the same leather jacket and drives his own car. The CEO who controls the future of AI still remembers to ask employees about their kids. Jensen's journey also demonstrates the power of long-term thinking in a world obsessed with quick results. His 15-year bet on CUDA seemed like a mistake for over a decade, but it eventually created the foundation for the AI revolution. The immigrant kid who survived reform school by learning to think beyond immediate problems became a CEO who could invest billions in technologies that wouldn't pay off for years. This patience and vision are increasingly rare in business, but absolutely essential for solving humanity's biggest challenges. Today, Jensen continues to push Nvidia toward even bigger goals. The company is working on quantum computing, robotics, autonomous vehicles, and AI applications that haven't been invented yet. At 61 years old, Jensen shows no signs of slowing down. His story proves that the American dream isn't just about individual success. It's about using that success to create opportunities for others. Nvidia employs over 30,000 people, right? Well, Jensen's a bit of an exception. Most of my other videos are about complete muppets who somehow got filthy rich from the most ridiculous, stupid ideas you've ever heard. So hit that subscribe button for tales of people making fortunes from absolute nonsense.